Hey, ladies and gentlemen, this is Miss Humbert here, and we're going to be doing the last part of Notes 5. So we're going to be talking over some of those applications. So basically, the zero product property can tell us how to factor quadratics. That's what the squared term means, a quadratic. So basically, if you were to graph a quadratic, it's going to take a shape like this, like an upside down U, or sometimes a right side up U. So we're talking about a flare here being launched from the ground, and we want to figure out how long it'll take to return to C. So it'll take a form of something like this, and we want to figure out at what point it's going to return to C. So really, all we have to do for that is let our height equal to 0. So this is still doing the quadratic formula, but by taking the quadratic formula, the zero product property. So by setting each of these quadratics equal to 0, we can figure out when that flare is going to hit the ground. So really, for number 9, all we have to do is solve this right here. So we have 0 is equal to 100t minus 16t squared. Well, that sure worked well. 16t squared. So first thing I want to do is take out a greatest common factor. So between 16 and 100, I can take out a 4 and a t. And when I do that, I'm left with 25 minus 4t. And that's equal to 0. Now here's what confuses students. Do you see how this has a t in it? This value has a t in it. So we can't just divide that greatest common factor like we did on number 8 because it has a t value. With that t value, that tells us that that's actually a solution. So we don't have to use the x at all for this one. By taking the greatest common factor, we found, our two factors. One of them just happens to be a single term. So I use the zero product property. Because this has a t in it, I can set it equal to 0. I can set this equal to 0 as well. So now I'm just going to solve for t. So t is equal to 0 when I solve that first one. Now I'm going to solve the second one. I'm going to start by subtracting 25 from both sides. So then I get negative 4t is equal to negative 25. Then I'm going to divide both sides by negative 4. And I get that t is equal to 6.25. And I want to label that seconds. So technically this guy over here is labeled seconds as well. Well, let's think about this logically. If we're launching a flare off the ground, you're right, at 0 seconds, it is going to be on the ground. Okay, but that's not when it's coming back to the ground. That's when we're starting on the ground. So our answer is actually 6.25 seconds. Next, let's take a look at number 10. So the length of a rugby field is 52 meters longer than its width. So let's go ahead and let's draw out our rugby field here. So we have a rugby field, and here's my width. And the length is the width plus 52. Okay, we want to write an expression for the area. So the area is going to be length times width. So W times W plus 52. And that's going to be equal to the area, which is 8,160. So now we need to solve this. We need to figure out what W is going to be. So the first thing I'm going to do to start off with is just distribute in that W. So that becomes W squared, and then I get 52W is equal to 8,160. Now here's an important thing for you to recognize. You cannot use the zero product property unless it's set equal to, well, you guessed it, 0. So I want to use the zero product property, but I can't do that until my 8,160 is brought over to the W, or to the other side. So then I have W squared plus 52W minus 8,160 is equal to 0. So now I have to set up my x. Now this is kind of a tricky x. So we're multiplying to 8,160 and adding to 52. So I know I need a positive and a negative product. Well, I'll be very honest with you. I have no idea what things go into 8,160. So I just start dividing. I divide it by 10, 20, 30, 40, 100. What I want you to do, pause the video, try dividing by some random numbers. See if you can get a positive and negative that works, and restart the video when you're done. So what you should have found was 120 and negative 68. So now we can go ahead and we can factor this guy. So then we're going to have w squared plus 120w minus 68w minus 8,160. Now that's going to be equal to 0 eventually. So now we're going to factor by grouping. Out of my first group, I can only take out a w, and then I'm left with w plus 120. Out of my second group, I need to take out a negative GCF. Between 68 and 8,106, I can actually take out 68. And I'm dividing each of these by a negative 68, so I'm left with a positive w plus 120. So then I notice that my leftovers are matching, so I can go ahead and write those out. And then I'm going to write what's left after that. And it's set equal to 0. So now I need to solve for w. So to solve for w, I'm going to set each of my factors equal to 0. So here I end up with w is equal to a negative 120, and here I end up with w is equal to 68. Well, a negative 120, negative distance doesn't make sense when we're talking about a rugby field. So my width is going to be 68 meters. Now it asks for the dimensions, so I need to find the length as well. So there's my width. To get the length, I need to take my width and add 52. And then I end up getting 120 meters. So my length is a positive 120 meters. My width is 68 meters. Next, let's take a look again at number 11. So we're talking about a pep rally and we're launching footballs, and we want to figure out when it's going to hit the ground. So it gives us a quadratic. To figure out when it's going to hit the ground, I just take my quadratic and I set it equal to 0. Now I can take out a GCF out of this. I see that the first term is negative. I like to avoid that when I can. So because I can take out a 2, I'm actually going to take out a negative 2. So then I get 8t squared minus 10t minus 3. Okay, now again, that 0 can be divided away into the greatest common factor because there's no letter with it. So because it's just a number, I can divide it away. And then I get 8t squared minus 10t minus 3, and that's going to be equal to 0. So now I can go ahead and set up my x. So I'm going to take 8 times a negative 3 to get a negative 24, and adding to a negative 10. So what's going to do that? We need a positive and a negative. So I'm going to do negative 12 and positive 2. So now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I have 8t squared minus 12t plus 2t minus 3 is equal to 0. So now I'm going to factor by grouping. Between 8 and negative 12, I can take out a 4 and a t, and then I'm left with 2t minus 3. Out of my second group, I can't take out a greatest common factor. So I'm going to take out a 1 just to remind myself that that 1 is there. And then I'm left with 2t minus 3. So then again, here I notice that my leftovers are matching. So I can go ahead and factor out those leftovers. So I have 2t minus 3, and then I have 4t plus 1. So now I can go ahead and I can set each of those factors equal to 0. So then I have 2t minus 3 is equal to 0, 4t plus 1 is equal to 0. So I'm just going to solve this in my head. Here you end up getting 3 halves, and here you end up getting negative 1/4. Well, we don't want to talk about negative time. It's not going to land on the ground after a negative amount of time. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that answer out. So it comes back to the ground after 3.5 seconds, which is the same as 1.5 seconds. It's going to return to the ground. Last but not least, let's take a look at number 12. So now we're talking about a gymnast and her height. And so we want to figure out when she's going to reach the floor or the ground. So again, our height is 0. So we're setting this quadratic equal to 0. So again, I can take out a greatest common factor. So I'm going to take out a negative greatest common factor. So I can take out a negative 8 out of everything. And then I'm left with positive 2 squared plus 1t plus 1 is equal to 0. Now again, that GCF I pulled out is just a number. So because it's just a number, I can divide it away into the GCF. So I divide both sides by 8, and then I'm left with 2t squared, and I'm sorry, these should be minuses. Minus 1t minus 1 is equal to 0. Okay, these should be minuses because I pulled out a negative. That was my mistake. Okay, so next I'm ready to factor. So I'm going to set up my x. I'm multiplying to a negative 2 and adding to a negative 1. So that's going to be a negative 2 and a positive 1. So now I'm going to use that to split up my t term. And now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to make my two groups. Group, group. So out of my first group, I can pull out a 2 and a t, and I'm left with t minus 1. Out of my second group, I can only pull out a 1, and then I'm left with t minus 1, and that's equal to 0. So now I see that I can factor these out, and then I'm left with 2t plus 1. So now I can take and set each of these factors equal to 0. So 2t plus 1 is equal to 0, and t minus 1 is equal to 0. So when you solve each of these equations, here you end up getting t is equal to a negative 1/2. Here you end up getting t is equal to 1. Again, the gymnast isn't going to return to the floor after negative time. That doesn't make sense. So our answer is t is equal to 1, and we want to make sure we label it. So she returns to the ground after 1 second. So you should have a completed note sheet. There is no Schoology quiz, so you can go ahead and continue on with the practice. Thanks for listening.